They never thought that, like what happened here in Tennessee, where the majority of citizens stood up and told our governor, no, don't do it. We don't want it. And we don't care what the federal government says in return. If they want to charge us something extra, we'll see them in court the first time they try. Because unfortunately, the way our court system's set up, we have to have standing before we can file a suit. And we don't have standing until it actually affects us. So it wouldn't have affected anyone officially until that first income tax return where they had to pay a penalty. And now, folks have had that, and I wish more people would file suit. You have standing now, folks. If you had to pay a penalty and you don't like that penalty, file a lawsuit. We could get enough people together to have a class action, and guess what? If you end up in a court where the judge is actually going to follow the letter of the law, you're going to win this lawsuit. Because no matter what the Supreme Court says, law is never settled, especially law that is based on precedent. And this is about a faulty argument. This fight isn't over. It's very disheartening when you see the Supreme Court attempt to overstep its bounds and overstep its authority and try to legislate something as monstrous as this power grab. But the fight's not done. There are still ways to fight against Obamacare. It still can be repealed. It still can be defunded. Do you hear me, John Boehner? Do you hear me, members of the House of Representatives who might be in line to take Boehner's place? The power of the purse resides in the House. You can continuously surrender it, or you can make a stand. And it's time you grew a backbone, maybe even some testicles, and stood up and said, public opinion be damned. But guess what? Your constant fear of a closure of the government isn't going to affect your re-election chances near as badly, or probably not even in the way that you expect it would. The American people as a whole, when it comes to across the nation, reject this law. They don't like this law. They've lost the policies they wanted to have, or they've lost policies altogether. And every time I hear somebody in the Obama administration talk about how many new people have insurance that didn't have it before because of Obamacare, I want them to tell me how many people have lost insurance because the policies they had before aren't available anymore or have become so expensive that nobody can afford it, even with your freaking subsidies. It doesn't even come up to a net wash. There are more people in America uninsured now than there were before. The difference is the people who are uninsured now, well, they were the folks that were kind of towards that middle range, up near that, what was left of the middle class and maybe a little bit higher. And, of course, the Democrats don't care about those people. They typically don't tend to be useful idiots. So they can't move their agenda with those folks. So they don't care if they're facing some terrible repercussion for their actions. Because in the end, the elitists are the elitists, and they don't really care about anybody else just as much as what you can do for them. Not exactly a hot news flash, but for those of you who aren't paying attention, if you're supporting them in this action, you might be one of those people. And that's their term for you, not mine. That's their term. They mentioned it before. Always take advantage. You never let a good crisis go to waste, and you always take advantage of the useful idiots. That's their term. The Supreme Court took a simple phrase, established by the states, plural with an S at the end, notice, and then during the course of their decision, wrote the most convoluted, backwards attempt to 43 different ways try and say there was some level of ambiguity when there was none. Zero. Nada. Not a bit. No ambiguity at all. And for those of you on the left who might not understand the word ambiguity, it means something unclear. In fact, this part of the law was extremely clear and precise and simple. It was meant to be easy to understand because it was a threat. It was a threat to the states. It was form your exchanges or face the wrath of your citizens who want it. You have people who are going to have to pay penalties, and they're going to be mad at you because you didn't establish an exchange. They couldn't afford to buy anything on the federal exchange because they didn't get any subsidies. But the IRS, whether they were, in this case, completely ignoring the fact that they weren't supposed to do it, or if this was some other convoluted way to try and create drama down the road as a sticking point for somebody to keep fighting over it, they went ahead and offered these tax credits to everyone buying on the exchanges there. Now, I had expressed my concern. Had this ruling went the way it had went, my concern was what was going to be to the citizens who, in an effort, whether they liked the law or not, in an effort to be legal and avoid the penalty, had bought policies and taken advantage of these subsidies. My concern was if the court came down the way it should have and these subsidies had been stripped, were these people suddenly going to have to pay back the IRS? Because that's what the IRS probably would try to do. Would Congress pull together enough to protect the citizens from having to pay that back, since the IRS would be the ones in violation of the law? Not the citizens. The citizens were just doing what they were told they could do. But the problem is we can't count on our legislature or our executive branch or our bureaucracy by any means. And certainly now, obviously, we can't count on our judicial branch to do the right thing, ever. We can't count on it anymore. So would those people have been protected? I doubt it. I dare say that they probably would have ended up having to pay back whatever they had gotten in the form of subsidies and those tax breaks, and then probably would have been prorated if they weren't able to continue paying for their policy and they lost it, would have probably then been hit with the penalty as well. Maybe not even prorated. Last year, they prorated. This year, who knows? I mean, that's a year-by-year policy change, according to the IRS. How can it possibly be law when so much of this is just IRS policy? Well, because the bureaucracy now has legislative authority. They just don't have to behave the same way our legislature or our executive branch does. So by rights, they have established themselves as their own branch of our government. That's why I keep saying we have 4 branches now. The majority of the bureaucracy still falls under the purview of the executive. I understand that. Okay? I'm not making an argument that they're all off by themselves. I'm just saying they behave as if they are. And in a lot of ways, you might as well make that assertion. I mean, how much longer till they do decide, well, we're independent of the executive in order to try and protect themselves? I mean, once they realize we get to make the rules, well, let's make this a rule too. You know, the exact kind of thing that our framers attempted to avoid. But we're so far down that rabbit hole. Ultimately, this still comes back to the simple fact that Chief Justice Roberts, I don't know, I'm beginning to wonder if maybe he really hasn't been blackmailed on this one. There's some thing going on here that keeps him from behaving responsibly when it comes to this law. Nothing about Obamacare as it's written is constitutional. Least of all this. But let's switch gears again. Let's look at the other big court case that came down this week, shall we? According to the Supreme Court, and even according to some people that I admire in the conservative realms, they want to say that the argument of the 14th Amendment actually was a solid argument, and it's not a states' rights issue because the states don't have the right to pass laws that are in violation of the U.S. Constitution. But that's not exactly the case. Otherwise, the concept of nullification wouldn't exist. And I really haven't heard very many people talk about nullification. I would like to know why people aren't talking about nullification. Maybe they hadn't come to that conclusion yet. But here's the thing. According to the Supreme Court, now same-sex marriage must be recognized in all 50 states. Now I'm going to tell you why the 14th Amendment isn't a legitimate argument in this case. They want to use the principle of equal protection under the law as the argument. I would concede that in that case, there is a constitutional requirement for the laws to be applied equally. And I'll tell you why that might be a problem for those pushing for this kind of thing kept coming if we start pushing back in the right ways. But the bottom line is, nowhere in the Constitution is there a constitutional right for heterosexual marriage. The Supreme Court cannot make a ruling based on the constitutionality of something that doesn't exist constitutionally. Marriage is not a right. In fact, for the very reason that I've told you on a multitude of occasions that I don't have an issue with same-sex marriage being recognized by a state, is the very reason why this ruling is wrong. And why my very learned friend, who is not a lawyer, I might add, is wrong on this topic too. I happened to see a Facebook post not long before coming on here, and a fellow talk show host, she's moved out of politics for the most part. She's doing a show now about business mentoring. And it's a very good show, and I still highly recommend her. And normally I agree with her at least 80% of what she has to say, but she's got this wrong like a lot of other people have this wrong on this particular topic, in so much as, it's not a state's issue. Does it require a license from the state? If the answer is yes, then it is a state's issue. Is there a specific part of the Constitution that says you have the right to get married? If the answer is yes, a certain part of the Constitution says yes, you do have the right to get married, then it becomes a constitutional federal level matter. If there is not a specific section of the Constitution, which, by the way, there is not, saying you have a right to get married, or saying that the federal government has the right to regulate marriage, or that the states have a right to regulate marriage, well, then it's not a federal matter. The correct ruling in this case, once and for all, should have been, get it out of the federal courts. This is a state issue. It's a state issue not because people are being treated equally under the law, but because there's no constitutional right for either side. So equal treatment under the law would be that there's no constitutional merit for either side. There doesn't exist a right under the Constitution for any individual to have this ceremony. This is, in fact, something that exists outside of the government altogether. And again, I make this point clear and simple. Marriage, true marriage, is a spiritual matter. True marriage has only to do with you, your partner, and whatever deity you believe in. Even if you don't believe in a deity. Maybe you're a climate changer and all you need is Mother Gaia to bless your union. Whatever. Maybe you're a complete total atheist and you don't believe, but you want to get